So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a special honor to start our presentation. This is the book written by our co-director of our project, Professor Martin Schulze Wessel, called Die übersehene Nation, the Overseen Nation. We have a book which is called Unexpected Nation, written some 20 years ago by a British scholar, now a different kind of book. And this book has a particular story which is related to our conference as well. Just let me tell you a story that 12 years ago, in 2014, exactly at June this month, the group of the German scholars, German historians, came to Ukraine to express their solidarity with Ukrainian scholars, with Ukraine altogether, in the wake of the Crimean annexation, Russian annexation of Crimea. And this group was headed by Professor Martin Schulze Wessel. We had a meeting in Kyiv, and the meeting, I think, was decision that we have to establish German-Ukraine Historical Commission. Later on, there has been first meeting in Munich, I believe, later on, and this where the commission has been established, and the first director of this commission was Professor Martin Schulze Wessel. I was co-director, so I had a chance and was honored to be president of this commission for 2 executive terms. And to a large extent, this current project is extension of the work of our commission, because basically we want to, our aim was to touch upon the history of Ukraine and Germany in a way they're related to each other, so to say. And so I would say that this is exactly what is the book about. We had several books which try to focus on Ukrainian history from German perspective. The books are not of good quality. You probably, they don't deserve specific mention, but this is really kind of first academic book, which is also a kind of public outreach book that has been largely born out of this war, of this kind of the circumstances nowadays. So the first book of their Professor Schulze Wessel was exactly about the empires, curse of empires, and this book followed by Übersehene Nation. Professor Martin Schulze Wessel will tell you more about the story of this book, how we come to as deal of this book. He worked on this book at the Oxford University when he has a stay there. And also a special honor to have a special guest. And this is my good friend and colleague, Professor Serhiy Stelmakh. Professor Serhiy Stelmakh is translating this book into Ukrainian, so he knows this book very well, and he's also Professor Martin Schulze Wessel, so he will also have something to tell. So this is why we proceed further. Professor Martin Schulze Wessel would have some kind of the introduction, followed by the comments of the Professor Stelmakh, and then open floor for questions and comments. So without further ado, let me pass my mic to Professor Martin Schulze Wessel.
Thank you so much, Yaroslav. It's a great honor for me to present the book here at Ukrainian Catholic University. And as Yaroslav Hrytsak already said, it's the result of more than 10 years of cooperation in the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission and in the framework of the Mykola Haievoi Center. And writing a synthesis is, of course, another task than writing a research work as you are doing it. It's partly also based on research, but the main task is to find something what keeps together German and Ukrainian relations in the 20th century, to find a thread through the history of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century. Yeah, I think it's not necessary to explain the motivation for this study. There is no other book about German-Ukrainian relations and about the history of German-Ukrainian relations. And this is already telling. I mean, there are dozens of books of German-French relations, and there are even 5 or 10 books about German-Polish relations, but this one is indeed the first about German-Ukrainian relations, and certainly it will not be the last one. writing it now, of course, means writing a history of the relations in a somehow existential moment. Germany depends on Ukraine. It's not a phrase to say that Ukraine defends not only its own sovereignty, but the security and freedom of Europe and of Germany especially, and Poland. This is a reality today. And at the same time, one can say this is on another level, that there's also some dependency of Ukraine on Germany with regard to the financing of the war. But this is, of course, without saying, on different levels, but there's an interdependency of both countries. And this is, I think, a good moment for writing a history of the relations. If the present of the relations is existential, one should know something about the history of the relations. I do not have the time to present the book in full, of course. I just want to limit myself to 4 theses. The first thesis is that since the 19th century, the German view on Ukraine has been characterized by a complex of not knowing, of ignorance, of disregard, and repression. That is, in the 18th century, the situation was somehow different. In the 18th century, there was quite a lot of knowledge between German ethnographers about Ukraine, and in the 19th century this vanished. There was little knowledge about the Ukrainian national culture. There were little poets from Ukraine which were read in Germany by a broader public. And this can be explained. It has one cause in the modern nation building. Other neighbors for Germany and other neighbors for Ukraine were in the 19th century more important. Presumably, nations always define themselves in negative distinction from other nations. For Germany, the significant others were France and Poland. France for cultural reasons and Poland for racial. And for Ukraine, there were Poland and Russia, the significant others. This means that Germany and Ukraine did not relate to one another negatively during the period of nation building. There is no German-Ukrainian hereditary enmity, as it was between Germany and France, for example. And this is not a bad beginning for relations. But there was another factor that was decisive for the relations, namely the special German-Russian ties that emerged during the Bismarck era, maybe before. These relations had many facets. For example, a Prussian-Russian interest in military topics, a German liberal interest in the Russian market, and in the 20th century, of course, also the socialist alliance between Germany and Soviet Russia. These ties also defined the relations with Ukraine. Germany adopted Russia's view on Ukraine. That means the special German-Russian ties meant that Germany viewed Ukraine through a Russian lens, not as a nation with its own high culture, but as a region with its regional folklore. In this respect, one can speak of a secondary colonial gaze, a perspective that Germany continued to cultivate until the very recent past, that is, at a time when it had long since abandoned its primary colonialism, for example, with regard to Poland. This form of secondary colonial gaze through the lens of another great power is something very specific, and I cannot find a comparison for it. Germany's failure to recognize the Ukrainian nation forms the central thread in the history of German-Ukrainian relations, the basso continuo, if you like. So the second thesis is, however, relations were also shaped by three wars in which Germany and Ukraine interacted in very different ways. The First World War, the Second World War, and the current Russian-Ukrainian war. During both world wars, Germany had an interest in exploiting Ukrainian raw materials, particularly agricultural resources. This was one of the reasons why the German army occupied Ukraine twice and crushed Ukrainian resistance in both wars. Nevertheless, I'm skeptical about drawing a clear parallel between the German role in the First and the Second World Wars and colonial rule. In the First World War, there was also German support for the formation of a modern Ukrainian state, although on the basis of unequal treaties. The relations were rather imperial than merely colonial. In the Second World War, however, they were exclusively colonial in nature, involving the ruthless exploitation of the country and the murder of millions of Ukrainian inhabitants. The German crimes in Ukraine between 1941 and 1945, the Shoah, the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, including the Ukrainians, the forced labor, which particularly affected Ukrainians, influenced the German perception of Ukraine well beyond 1945. The German perspective was now characterized by ignorance and repression. It is true that the process of coming to terms with guilt in Germany generally, and not just in relation to Ukraine, took place late and only partially. In case of Ukraine, however, two additional factors came into play. The victims of the war, as well as the victory of the war, were never attributed to Ukraine, but to the Soviet Union, and after 1991 to Russia. And we have already seen the cover of, this is the book. This is the first book, The Curse of the Empire, which I started to write in Oxford, and this is the Overseen Nation. And we have already seen the cover, I think, of this week's edition of the Spiegel, of the German, the leading German news journal, weekly. Our war against Russia, not our war against the Soviet Union, but Russia. And indeed, I mean, there are experts in the redaction of the. Of course, there are experts for history in the redaction of the Spiegel newspaper. They knew well what they did, and it was just to have a catchy title, yeah, to sell it better. And only the subtitle is about the Soviet Union. This is amazing. Yeah. And the second reason, until very recently, Ukrainian collaboration with Nazi Germany occupied a disproportionately large share of German memory. Admittedly, there was, of course, and we talked about that, collaboration and anti-Semitic pogroms in Ukraine, as almost everywhere in occupied Eastern Europe. But in the German view of Ukraine, they played a disproportionate role. And this was due to the fact that since the war, the Soviet Union had waged a targeted and quite successful campaign to portray Ukraine as a fascist nation. The aim was to discredit and stifle all of Ukraine's national aspirations, and in particular the national struggles that continued in Western Ukraine even after 1945. Soviet propaganda in West Germany targeted Ukrainian emigres, not least in Munich, and discredited them by accusing them of collaborating with Nazi officials. This also left its mark on the German public. A large section of the left-wing and liberal spectrum did not see Ukraine as a victim nation, which it of course was, but as a perpetrator. And the extension of this campaign against Ukraine targeted also at German politicians, and Kai Struve just talked about that, the Oberländer course. The third thesis is linked to the third thesis, to the second thesis, excuse me. The fact that communist propaganda in Moscow denounced Ukraine's aspirations for freedom as a fascist movement had specific consequences for the perception in West Germany and in East Germany. As already mentioned, the demonization of Ukraine in West Germany meant that Ukraine tended to become a non-issue among the left-wing and liberal public. The Kremlin's demonization strategy worked. On the right of the political spectrum, there were occasional expressions of sympathy towards Ukraine and Ukrainian institutions such as the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, and these emotions or sympathies were based on shared anti-Bolshevism. This ideological polarization of Ukraine ran counter to a genuine interest in Ukrainian history and culture. It is obvious that there was also an ideological perception of Ukraine in the GDR. This can be demonstrated by the example of a historical research of Eduard Winter in Halle, who was a very knowledgeable expert on Ukrainian history, especially Ukrainian church history, but used it very selectively as material for his scheme of a cross-epochal conflict between Rome and Moscow. However, the GDR also saw the first German-Ukrainian people-to-people contacts, particularly within the framework of the first German-Ukrainian town twinning, which was established in the early 1960s between Leipzig and Kiev. Generally speaking, it can be said that an ideological view of Ukraine was characteristic of both German states, with negative impacts for any genuine interest in Ukraine. And the fourth thesis, Ukraine was not only an object of German interest, or rather non-interest, but it had also its agency. Ukrainian intellectuals played a leading role in forging German-Ukrainian relations. During the First World War, it was people such as the geographer Stepan Rudnitsky and the political thinker Dmytro Dontsov who addressed the German public with their vision of a Ukrainian nation. This can be demonstrated. For example, by these booklets, which were quite typical for the publications of Ukrainian intellectuals during the war, in the immigration, during the First World War. That is, during the First World War, there were intellectuals who addressed the German public with booklets which were quite easy to read, but based on knowledge about Ukraine that was not widespread in Germany or not spread at all. And by this, the German public was informed about the geography of Ukraine. Hrushevsky also wrote a booklet about the history of Ukraine. And there were authors who are not so much known anymore, like Kushnir, who had a monthly publication. And here's one publication about Ukraine and her role in the current war against Russia. And the idea of most of these publications was to stress, just firstly, to inform the German public about Ukraine, and the second, to stress the importance of Ukraine in the First World War in relation to Russia, that Russia could only be overcome with help of Ukraine. And the idea, of course, was to build an independent Ukraine with German help. And with this perspective, these authors developed an idea of Ukraine, which was invented in a sense that could be understood in Germany. That is, it was not a nation with a losung of liberté, égalité, fraternité, but it was shaped in the sense of a cultural nation with its own tradition that is very close to the German notion of identity, of national identity. One can say it's a particularist version of a nation. Today, again, during a war, a process of national self-discovery is once again taking place in Ukraine, and it's once again connected with transnational communication and interaction, of course, also with a self-understanding of on the basis of own national history. The point of reference is no longer the Germany of 1914, of course, and it's not the Germany of today either, the main point of reference. It's no longer the particular cultural nation, but it's rather European and universal values. Ukraine can claim not only to profess values such as freedom and civil society, that is the values of the West, but also to fight for them. And the tragedy of the present day is that the West no longer exists as a transnational community. Europeans are on their own when it comes to defend not only security interests, but also shared liberal and civic values. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Before I proceed to our second distinguished guest, may I ask you, are there kind of short questions to what was just Martin says? Are there any questions? Raise your hand if there are any. Yeah, plus curiosity also counts, yeah.
In the 18th century, there was real better knowledge of Ukraine. Could you elaborate a little bit about it? That is, you said that in the 19th century, this was forgotten because France and Poland played a greater role, and this is clear to me. Yeah. But what kind of knowledge was there of Ukraine, and in what sense in the 18th century? If you could just because
it's of course allied knowledge. It's all knowledge in the fields of geography, ethnology, and there was a lot of work done and things published. And this does not mean that there was a general knowledge about Ukraine in Germany. And on the other side, I mean, there's quite a lot quite a lot of knowledge, more than one thinks, about the early modern period that was preserved in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Just to give some kind of illustration, correct me if I'm wrong. The only two books that has been written on Ukrainian history in German language or in any Western language was the book written by Engel by the end of the 18th century, first book on Galician Volhynian Kingdom and second book on the Cossacks. So it's explicitly books on Ukrainian history, end of 18th century. Then there was none to the 20th century. Yeah, this is what is kind of history? This is global world history. So this is the world history. The first set of world history has Ukraine in 2 volumes, and the second, which emerged 30 years later, has no volume on Ukraine because again, the idea of non-state nation.
Thank you so much. Like my question was actually about what role like history and historical scholarship played in political and military cooperations, but you partially answered this. So I wanted to bring the person of Eduard Winter, and because I'm researching the biography of Ivan Kripakevich, and I found that actually in like middle 1950s he was writing articles, and he was mentioning like wartime period works of Eduard Winter. So I wanted to ask you if do you know if there are some like mentions vice versa? So for example, if Eduard Winter or someone for like other scholars, they mention like Ukrainian scholars who were very active during the Second World War, and like it might be a bit naive, but I think also during the Second World War there was a major book of Volodymyr Kubyovich and Ivan Kripakevich about geography and his geography mainly, and geography and history of Ukrainian state. And I think in 1943 it was even some fragments of Ivan Kripakevich and Kubyovich. They were published in a tiny book for the internal use for the German like Wehrmacht, Nazi army and administration. Thanks.
Well, I cannot tell you whether there is a direct quotation by Winter. He was during the war, he was in Ukraine. Polina Bawinska told me about that. In Dnipro, okay, yeah. So he is a highly interesting figure, maybe the most opportunistic intellectual of the 20th century. He was he started as a Catholic priest, then was at the Heydrich Stiftung during the Second World War, and then had a career in the GDR, first at the University of Halle and at the end in the Academy of Science in Eastern Berlin. But nevertheless, there are books which are still valuable, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. I also have a...
If this is talking about Eduard Winter.
Yeah, about Eduard Winter. Yeah, question about Eduard Winter. So he's really very interesting, and you devote to him several pages. And I think he is really a bit underestimated and forgotten now in Ukraine, because he was probably the first scholar who distinguished Ukrainian Enlightenment as a separate Enlightenment from Russian Enlightenment, and even as a phenomenon that preceded the Russian Enlightenment and exerted considerable influence on the Russian Enlightenment. So he was really he was not only knowledgeable about Ukraine, I would say, but he was he had a clear understanding about distinctiveness of Ukrainian intellectual history from both Russian and Polish intellectual history during the early modern period. And he exerted considerable impact on Ukrainian scholars in Soviet Ukraine, on those who did intellectual history of the 17th, 18th century. He was in touch with them, and they cited him. So this was really very interesting, and I'm wondering how can we explain this phenomenon of Eduard Winter, because was he really unique, and did he had any impact on German historians, both in East Germany or Western Germany? Did he have any disciples who continued to focus on Ukrainian history or East European history more broadly? I have some answers here you didn't mention is, yes, so he was a supervisor of Ivan Wysiak Rudnitsky in Charles University in Prague. But maybe you could elaborate a bit on really this very interesting thing.
It's a very interesting question. He was, I would say he was a stranger in the GDR. He was always associated with his past, maybe more with the Catholic past than with the National Socialist past. And nevertheless, he was very authoritative as a member of Academy of Science, was extremely influential, for example, in setting up a huge research project with the Soviet Union on the great research projects in geography of the 18th century, in the research about the 18th century. And I'm too young to know him, but when I studied in Berlin in the year 1989, at the time of my dissertation, then there were meetings with historians from Eastern Berlin, and there was, of course, a big crisis how they could go on, which traditions they could use. And the idea and the person they did refer to was ironically Eduard Winter. Yeah.
I also have to mention that he collected and published the volumes we won from translated in Germany, but also made some very important omissions. This is when Sakurinsky wrote we wrote a review of this book, and he said this is kind of intellectual dishonesty on his side. But my hypothesis, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe one reason why he did distinction Ukraine from Russia because he dealt with church history. And the Roman politics, in the sense, if this guy focused on Roman Catholic Church history, it's quite evident that Ukraine and Russia was different spaces. Again, this is my hypothesis. I believe did anybody have written his biography?
Yeah, there are two biographies, but I mean these aspects are not so much highlighted.
Because he's a very notorious figure that everybody knows. This shifts from one camp to another camp. So now let me just give a floor to Professor Serhiy Stelmakh. Serhiy will be talking Ukrainian. If I may ask you, raise the hand, who doesn't understand Ukrainian? How many of us? So there's many. So actually, we'll proceed this way, that I will be translating partially. Some parts will go there, that order instead. I'm not perfect translator, but at least I try to convey the message that Serhiy was saying. So Serhiy, floor is yours.
Дякую, Ярославе. Ну да, мене трошки поставили в таку складну ситуацію, тому що книжка німецькою мовою, перекладати її треба українською, а виступати ще й треба англійською. Тому я попросив Ярослава, щоб він мені сьогодні допоміг, і я менше напружувався з німецькою, українською на англійську.
This is a very challenging task because Serhiy's got translated book into Ukrainian, but doesn't speak English, so this is kind of the very complicated things to do here.
Ну, по-перше, те, що вже викликало такий великий інтерес після виступу Мартіна, і, зокрема, постать Едуарда Вінтера, хоча я не дивуюсь, тому що ми ж знаходимося в католицькому університеті, і, відповідно, Едуард Вінтер був істориком релігії і займався якраз саме цією проблемою. Отже, я так розумію, що все-таки книжка знайде свого читача після того, як вона буде перекладена українською мовою.
So he says there's no really kind of surprise that we're talking about Edward Winter because still in the Catholic University and Winter was doing the church, specifically Catholic history. But this is also one of proof that the book will find his reader or his and her readers.
Ну, у мене стоїть дуже складне завдання, тому що я з одного боку виступаю як перекладач, а з іншого боку як історик, і до того ж історик, який займається історією Німеччини. останні роки, і я менше уваги звертаю на історію України, хоча зрозуміло, що я так чи інакше, але знаю про німецько-українські зв'язки в силу своєї специфіки, своєї спеціалізації.
So Serhiy is kind of, again, it's more even challenging to us because Serhiy is not historian of Ukraine per se. He studies German, so then he doesn't know that much on German-Ukrainian relations.
Другий момент, друга складність полягає в тому, що мені доведеться представляти книжку, яка ще не перекладена українською мовою і не опублікована, і переважна більшість, я так розумію, слухачів от з цією книжкою не знайомі.
And the second task or the second problem is or issue that as we presume that this book is still not translated into Ukrainian and that not many people, probably nobody who read this book has kind of knowledge about this, what this book about.
Нещодавно я був присутнім, підключився до обговорення книжки Мартіна, яка відбулася на платформі Німецько-Української історичної комісії. І мене дещо здивували там достатньо критичні зауваження професора Андреаса Хайнемана.
So Serhiy was taking part in the online presentation discussion this book that was made in the framework of Ukrainian Historical Commission, and he was rather surprised because one of the participants had rather critical comments on this book.
Ну, там було в основному стосовно однієї частини книжки Мартіна, це те, що стосується якраз колаборації українців під час Другої світової війни. І наскільки я розумію, там були критичні зауваження, що Мартін не настільки докладно розглянув ці питання.
Criticism focused on a particular chapter of the book, the chapter that did with Ukrainian collaboration with Nazi, and the criticism was that Professor Martin Schulze did pay detailed attention to this kind of collaboration.
Я ще раз кажу, я був здивований, тому що, на мою думку, це дещо абсолютно інша книжка. Ну, ми маємо, наприклад, український переклад книжки присутнього тут Кая Струве, яка абсолютно є наукова монографія, написана для спеціалістів, де докладно розглянуті дуже важливі питання. Книжка Мартіна – це книжка трошки іншого формату і іншої спрямованості.
So Serhiy was surprised more so because, moreover, because the book of the Martin Schulze Wessel is quite different character, has different aim. It's not particularly monographic book that deals with collaboration. We have another special in this room, which is Professor Kai Struve, who wrote in detail on the collaboration. So this is where he has a kind of description of this process. And the book of Martin Schulze Wessel has a different character and different aim.
Іншими словами, це книжка, те, що вона зараз називається non-fiction, тобто це та література, яка розрахована на широкого читача. І вона не є абсолютно спеціалізованою, вузькоспеціалізованою книжкою, розрахованою на спеціалістів-істориків, які будуть відшукувати там для себе якісь абсолютно незнайомі і нові речі.
So this is a book which has different characters. What you mentioned, this is kind of non-fiction synthesis, which is for a very general reader. And you could hardly expect detailed discussion of very particular historical moments.
Це дуже важливо, тому що ми, по-перше, повинні зрозуміти ту аудиторію, для якої вона була написана.
So this is very important because I understand to whom this book was addressed, who is supposed to read this book.
Ну, ми прекрасно знаємо, що, наприклад, на українському ринку або в перекладах, скажімо, тих же німецьких книжок німецьких авторів, у нас є два пласти літератури. Перше – це наукові монографії, які видаються виключно для спеціалістів. І другий – це, скажімо, ось цей науково-популярний сегмент або узагальнюючі книги, які розраховані на широкого читача.
So this is evident because basically we have two trends of the book which are related to history. One trend is a typically focused academic kind monographies that are for the very focused specialists to read, and there is another type of book or as a synthesis that are for a very general reader.
І мені здається, що у сучасних українських істориків, це вже з свого власного досвіду, я можу поділитися, іноді виникає така спокуса, коли вони читають або бачать переклад книжки іноземного автора з історії України, то у них є декілька таких ключових позицій. Перша позиція – це певне однозначне відторгнення.
So, and this is kind of evident or expected that among historians, particularly Ukrainian historians, there is specific tendency or even bias. Once they read a book, general book, especially published, written by the non-Ukrainian historian, he's a kind of slightly disdain to this kind of the book and this author.
А чому, і вони кажуть, чому нас можуть навчити з української історії зарубіжні історики? Ми знаємо краще українську історію, ніж пишуть зарубіжні історики. Це перша позиція.
So there will be a general approach or general position that why should they learn, teach us, because we know much better our Ukrainian history than they do.
А друга позиція була характерна, я думаю, більшою мірою на початку 90-х років, тобто десь 25 років тому, коли вважалося, що все, що написали зарубіжні історики, і все, що було перекладено українською, ось це є певний історіографічний канон.
And there is another trend, quite opposite trend, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where there's a new books emerged translated in Ukraine. So they were expected as a kind of new historiographical canon because there's nothing else.
І ця позиція тривалася, і це такі дві позиції, вони були достатньо тривалими, і я думаю, що зараз ситуація трошки міняється, але не дуже. І такі дві речі, вони спостерігаються. І мені здається, що основне питання тут полягає в тому, основна проблема для українських істориків, української історіографії полягає в тому, що вони не розуміють, з якою метою, по-перше, і для яких читачів ці книжки були написані, і з якою метою вони взагалі перекладаються українською мовою.
So those been two opposite tendencies which were very persistent and still are. So many historians, especially in Ukraine, do understand why we do need this kind of history. What kind of history is that?
Мені здається, що тут дуже гарну відповідь на це питання дав видатний німецький, австрійський історик Андреас Капелер, коли ми працювали над перекладом його «Kleine Geschichte der Ukraine», «Мала історія України», він сказав таку дуже просту річ, яка, на мою думку, якраз і має, в принципі, сформувати погляд на перекладну літературу. В кожній історіографії дуже важливо, як на історію власної країни дивляться за кордоном. Тобто це своєрідний певний погляд ззовні. І цей погляд ззовні дає можливість змінити фокус погляду на свою власну історію. Тобто подивитися, на які аспекти, скажімо, звертають увагу зарубіжні історики, і тим самим, можливо, виявити нові дослідницькі поля, які вони тим самим можуть відкривати.
So the best answers probably was provided by the Austrian or German historian Andreas Kepler, which I believe the name is familiar to you. He was said to Serhiy when he was translating the book, Kepler book, Kleine Geschichte der Ukraine, which is probably in my opinion, one of the best synthesis of Ukrainian history. And so Kepler says that this kind of work has deep sense because this provide outside perspective, how your national story is seen outside and where could be focus put, what has been overseen or what be outlined and what is left to be done, especially this kind of perspective from outside.
Власне, з цих позицій я би хотів би трошки розповісти про книжку Мартіна. Ще раз я хочу сказати, це література нон-фікшн, вона розрахована на широкого, в перекладі українською мовою, на широкого читача, на широкого українського читача. Тобто вона не дає уявлення про всі аспекти української історії. Це треба одразу, в принципі, про це зазначити.
So taking hint from Kepler, so he's going to tell what is the worst, what is the main achievement of the book by Martin Schulze Wessel.
Я б навіть сказав, книжка Мартіна, вона не розкриває всі аспекти німецько-українських взаємин.
So definitely book doesn't cover all the aspects of German-Ukrainian relations.
Справа в тому, що вона дає лише певні, на мою думку, деякі перспективні моменти, які Ну, я не є спеціалістом з німецько-українських взаємин. Я давно не займаюся цією проблематикою, хоча я знаю, наприклад, багатьох українських істориків, які займаються цими проблемами.
So even so, Serhiy is not a specialist in German-Ukrainian relations. This book helps him a lot to understand what is really the main topic subject that has to be discussed and highlighted in the German-Ukrainian relations.
Я звернув трошки пізніше увагу на те, що мені здається доволі перспективним для, скажімо, досліджень уже українських і навіть німецьких істориків в плані німецько-українських взаємин, на які Мартін звертає увагу в своїй книжці.
So later on, I will focus on the specific kind of issues that are omitted or have been, so to say, taken care in the book of the Martin Schulze Wessel.
Книжка взагалі складається із 6 розділів. Тому і ці розділи в більшості, ну, особливо якщо ми говоримо про перші 3 розділи, то вони для багатьох, скажімо, істориків, які так чи інакше займаються проблемами німецько-українських взаємин в цей період, достатньо добре відомі. І ті факти, які Мартін там наводить.
I feel terrible because I cannot keep this translation. Western is very rough, but still, do excuse me. So this is the book consists of the 6 chapters, and Serhiy is talking now of the 3 first chapter.
Але я б звернув би увагу на розділи, на розділ 4 і на розділ 5, які, на мою, ну, не кажучи вже про, на розділ 4 і 5. По-перше, 4 розділ – це українсько-німецькі взаємини під час Холодної війни. Розділ 5 – це німецьке і українське питання після 1989 року. Умовно скажемо так, значить, Україна в німецькомовному просторі після 1989 року, тобто після об'єднання Німеччини.
So Serhiy particularly want to focus on 2 chapters, chapter number 4 and chapter number 5. Chapter number 4 is the Cold War, German relations during the Cold War, and the 5th chapter is the post-89, when the fall of Berlin Wall and when Germany was reunited.
Ви розумієте, ми достатньо, в принципі, добре знаємо про українсько-німецькі зв'язки українців в Німеччині, українських інтелектуалів в Німеччині в 19 столітті, в першій половині 19 століття, тобто в періоду Першої світової війни, і навіть міжвоєнний період.
We know sufficiently well what was going on in intellectual history, Ukrainian intellectuals in the German context in the 19th century until this First World War, even until interwar period.
Те ж саме можна сказати і про період Другої світової війни, і навіть після Другої світової війни, тоді, коли велика кількість українців, які були працювали як примусові робітники в Німеччині, вони були або ж повернулися, або ж залишилися в Німеччині. У нас також є достатньо, на мій погляд, достатньо серйозна наукова література. Ну, от, скажімо, та ж Пастушенко займалася українцями в Німеччині після Другої світової війни і під час Другої світової.
We also know relatively well what was going during Second War, especially giving the numbers of Arbeiters that work in Germany, and there is a lady named Pastushenko who wrote a very good monograph on the subject.
Але дуже багато українців залишилися після Другої світової війни в Німеччині. При цьому ми маємо пам'ятати, що Німеччина після 45-го року була розділена на 2 частини – Західна Німеччина і Східна Німеччина. І якщо багатьох українців все-таки вдалося інтернувати, знову повернути їх в Україну, то значна частина українців, наприклад, в Західній Німеччині, вона залишилася.
We have to take into account that there are a large number of Ukrainians that stayed in Germany, because most of us Arbeiter, they moved back to Ukraine, but significant part, mostly they were intellectuals, political leaders, they stayed in Germany, and there was both in the Eastern and the Western, but particularly present in the Western Germany.
В 1948 році в західних окупаційних зонах залишалося 438 тисяч колишніх військовополонених та примусових робітників із Південної та Східної Європи. Питання. а скільки з них було українців залишилося? Ми знаємо, яку кількість українців було після Другої світової війни повернулися в Радянський Союз. Ми знаємо, скільки з них поїхало до Сполучених Штатів, Канади, Австралії, але яка кількість і достатньо значна кількість залишилася в Німеччині?
We know the exact statistics. 1948, there was 438,000 people, Ostarbeiter, prisoners of the war from the Eastern Europe. We don't know how many has left there, because many has been transported back to the Soviet Union. Some left to the North America, but we know the numbers what were left in Germany.
Мартін описує те, що ці українці, вони знаходились у спеціальних таборах і навіть були створені спеціальні табори для українців. Дуже цікаво, він звертає увагу на те, що і матеріальне становище українців в цих таборах були набагато кращим навіть, ніж західних німців. І це стосується, зокрема, забезпеченнями, норми калорій, наскільки там 2300-2500 калорій українцям виділялося на день, а німцям 1550. Але при цьому, я вам хочу сказати вже як спеціаліст з історії Німеччини, ніде в західних окупаційних зонах 1500 калорій не дотримувалися. У французькій окупаційній зоні було, я вам скажу так, 980 калорій на день. 980 калорій на день – це один Біг Мак і пакетик картоплі фрі.
Oh, history is a tough subject. You see, it's not that tough as mathematics. So the stories. Let me continue the story. So there's many Ukrainians who've been left in the Western Germany, occupied territories of the Western territories. They were kept in special camps, so-called displaced person, DPs. And as a matter of fact, this is irony. They're doing better than local Germans, because their provision was much better, and Serhiy provided the numbers of calories. So to say, so exactly, the number of calories is a problem here. So скільки було калорій в українських таборах?
2300.
Oh, so the rational for Ukrainians was 2,300 per day, which for Germans it was 1,500, much less. In French zone, it was 980, which is approximately Big Mac and French fry per day. So this is relatively, they will say Ukrainians were doing relatively well, much better than Germans and even those who in French zone.
Але справа в тому, що коли ці українці, ті, які залишилися в Німеччині, табори закрилися. Безумовно, багато із цих, не тільки українців, це були і поляки, це були вихідці із південних регіонів Європи, які не повернулися на свою батьківщину, а залишилися в Німеччині. Безумовно, вони залишилися без утримання, тобто їм ці продовольчі пайки не давали. Що вони робили? Вони поповнювали армію грабіжників, які грабували німецькі сім'ї.
So this is another part of the story. So basically, it was provision on the paper quite often, documents, but not real, so to say. And many, quite often, they have no this kind of provision. So what they did, they robbed the local German population.
Це стосувалося не лише тільки, скажімо, українців, як я вже сказав, це була повсюдна ситуація в Німеччині, в Західній Німеччині, тоді, коли існував чорний ринок. Ми ці сторінки маємо також пам'ятати, і я думаю, що на це також треба буде звертати увагу, якщо ми досліджуємо історію українсько-німецьких взаємин. Там є не тільки ті сторінки, які були для нас приємними, але і є неприємні сторінки.
So this is the side of Ukrainian, German-Ukrainian students we have to remember. And so they were taboo on silence because they were important. Give us a kind of the shadow history, shadow part of history, black market, all the kind of things.
Наступний момент, який мені також видається дуже важливим, це з огляду на те, на що звертає увагу Мартін у своїй книжці, це те, що німецьке суспільство, повоєнне німецьке, західно-німецьке суспільство, по суті, створило умови для того, щоб а українці, ну, скажімо так, замкнулися в собі, в своїй культурі, в своїй національній самобутності в Західній Німеччині. Тобто, на відміну від багатьох інших, вони не були інтегровані і їм не давали певні привілеї як окремій національності.
This is another interesting aspect, that most of Ukrainians who stayed in Germany by that time, they were not integrated into German society, intentionally not integrated, unlike in the Ukrainians in other countries, and this to a certain extent ghettoized. I mean, they look like they lived like in a separate ghetto within the German community.
Ну, безумовно, ну, Мартін із Мюнхена, і, безумовно, власне, він підкреслює те, що Франц Йозеф Штраус, він абсолютно підтримував створення українських культурних і наукових інституцій, і це правильно. Хоча, мені видається, тут треба, і Мартін про це пише прямо, що в основному ми знаємо лише тільки на словах про те, що Штраус підтримував якраз український культурний рух, але, я так зрозумів, немає документальних підтверджень.
So Martin tells the story, Malthus tells the story very well, the Bavaria case, the Ferdinand Joseph Strauss, Franz Josef, he was very supportive of Ukrainians. He took care about the cultural activity, all the kind of things, but it was, we don't really know to what extent it was real or just proclaimed.
Наступний момент – це те, що саме ось така скажімо, політика епохи Аденауера, а тут треба сказати, що українські організації, які залишилися в Німеччині, вони дуже швидко пристосувалися до такої, ну, або, скажімо, напівдемократичної системи епохи Аденауера, де поступово починалася реінтеграція націонал-соціалістів, і багато правих українських організацій, вони підтримували якраз цю політику епохи Аденауера.
So this is another interesting point, because basically if Ukrainians get used to such a condition, many of them, especially those who are from nationalistic milieu, they accommodated to the politics by the Adenauer to reintegrate the former Nazis in the political system of Germany.
Поліна Барвінська, про яку вже сьогодні згадували, професор Поліна Барвінська, вона зараз, наскільки я знаю, в Регенсбурзі. В минулому році ми з нею говорили, вона займається темою там українськими соціалістами в повоєнній Німеччині. Тема локальна, дуже цікава. Єдине, що я у неї запитував, а от якою мірою ми можемо прослідкувати хоча б якийсь вплив, скажімо, українських соціалістів, ну, наприклад, на німецьку соціал-демократичну партію? Чи існували якісь зв'язки між ними? І поки що це питання залишається відкритим.
So here is illustration. We know Professor Berlina Berwinska. She was mentioned several times. She focused on German-Ukraine relations, especially in post-war. And Serhiy asked her during her recent meeting, and Polina now works in Regensburg. Originally, she's from Odessa, but because of the war, she moved to Regensburg. She's there, and she's studying the leftist Ukrainian, socialist Ukrainian, who found themselves in this part. And so he asked to what extent this Ukrainian socialist had any impact, if any, on the German social democrat party. It seems the impact was very little, if any.
Тобто навіть в історії Федеративної Республіки Німеччини і українців в Федеративній Республіці Німеччини, не кажучи вже про, скажімо, ті події, які відбувалися після 1989 року, зокрема чиста політика, як Федеративна Республіка Німеччини співпрацювала вже з сучасною Україною, є дуже багато, на мій погляд, таких відкритих питань, на які Мартін акцентує увагу. Тобто він дає, по суті, на мою думку, ось те, що ми, знаєте, кажемо завжди, хороша наукова робота, вона полягає не в тому, що вона має бути завершеною, а в тому, що вона має відкривати нові питання, нові нові простори для наступних робіт.
So this probably is the one of the main, or probably the major achievement of the book that we discussed today, that Professor Schulze Wessel exactly highlights this kind of the topics which has to be investigated with many of them.
Наступний дуже важливий момент, на який звертає увагу в своїй книжці Мартін, це Німецька Демократична Республіка. Ось тут для мене завжди залишалася така біла пляма, як Україна для Німеччини була такою, weiße Fleck, білою плямою тривалий час, так і для мене українці в Німецькій Демократичній Республіці були також такою білою плямою. Єдине, що ми могли і знали, і ще за радянські часи ми могли в підручниках прочитати, це якесь там економічне співробітництво між підприємствами або робітниками українських підприємств і східно-німецьких підприємств, вірніше, ГДРівських підприємств, будемо говорити так.
And here is another achievement of Professor Martin Schulze Wessel. He turned his attention to one of the blank spots in German-Ukrainian relations. It is history of those Ukrainians who stayed in GDR, Democratic Republic, because this is story quite unknown, has been not studied, and all in the Soviet Union was limited to the kind of the story, limited to this kind of the economic cooperation between Soviet Ukraine and GDR.
І тут Мартіна є тут параграф, який називається «Червоний прапор Кривого Рогу». Це доволі відома історія про взаємини робітників Донбасу і робітників Німецької Демократичної Республіки. Але...
Окей. Ні, не хочеш скінчити твердження?
Ні, не хочу, я потім продовжу. Скажи просто про відому.
So, when Professor Martin Schulze Wessel focused on very particular history, it's relatively known here. It's a history relations between workers of Donbass with the workers in GDR, and it's the story of the red flag of Kryvyi Rih. I just want to draw attention that Zelensky comes from Kryvyi Rih, so this should be attention that this context of the story.
Той, хто народився в Радянському Союзі, в радянській Україні, той навіть пам'ятає, був перекладений роман німецького автора. Він був відомий про цю історію. Це там дуже багато, як завжди, міфів.
Я народився в Радянському Союзі, не пам'ятаю ці книжки. Скажи, яка це книжка? So let's skip this part. Let's go to this part.
Але якось німецький історик, один із найкращих спеціалістів з історії Німецької Демократичної Республіки і Східної Німеччини, історик українського походження, Ілько Саша Ковальчук, чия книжка «Шок свободи» вже перекладена українською мовою, ви можете з нею познайомитися. Так ось він мені прислав книжки українських казок, які були перекладені німецькою мовою в Німецькій Демократичній Республіці.
So there's a younger scholar, Ilko Sasha Kovalchuk. He, by the way, was born in village nearby my village. This is another collections here. He is now a rather famous historian in Germany, and he sent to Serhiy a collection of Ukrainian fairy tales translated into German, especially for the German Democratic Republic readers.
Тобто це відкриває ще один пласт, на мою думку, дуже важливих таких можливих досліджень, нових певних напрямів. Чи була, скажімо, дійсно українці настільки незнайомою якоюсь, скажімо, нацією чи незнайомим народом для німців у Східній Німеччині, навіть попри, скажімо, соціалістичну або комуністичну ідеологію.
So this raises another, and this is a very important question. Were Ukrainians really unseen in GDR, which is another part of Germany?
Тому, коли вже я буду завершувати, я розумію, що я втомився, скажімо так, це була така попередня презентація книжки. Я думаю, що коли Константин Сігов і видавництво «Дух і літера» звернулися знову до мене з проханням після того, як ми зробили книжку переклад Ілька Саші Ковальчука, яку книжку німецького автора нам ще раз перекласти, я порадив книжку, безумовно, Мартіна Шульце Весселя. А чому? Тому що я знаю декілька книжок в німецькому вже просторі, які були видані після 2022 року з історії України. Але мені здалося, що все-таки ця книжка може бути більш цікавою для широкого українського читача. Це раз. По-друге, і навіть для історика вона може відкрити певні якісь або наштовхнути на певні якісь наукові теми і проблеми, які можна буде досліджувати далі.
So, we've come to conclusion. So, Serhiy just finished translation the book of the Ilyas Sasha Kovalchuk, and he was asked by the publishing house what would be the next book to translate, and the first book he suggested exactly this book for Martin Schulze Wessel, because again, he considers this as a very important book, especially for both for Ukrainian historical community, but also for a general reader. Okay.
Дякую.
Thank you so much. This is like in famous song, Killing Me Softly with Here song. I prayed that he would finish. Thank you. Thank you. So questions and comments. And now we have come to kind of discussion. A real kind of discussion. Дякую дуже, Сергій. Дякую. Я просто пожартував. Прошу вас.
Sure. Yeah. So my question was just asking if you could speak a bit more about the more recent history in regards to Ukrainian-German relations, but particularly about how, things that Germany did or German stances on various issues, what effect they've had on the trajectory of Ukraine. Anything more you can talk about that, particularly post-independence and then 2014 and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the generous comment. And with regard to your question, I think I have 3 chapters about this post-1991 period, and it's difficult to put it in just a few phrases. One could ask what is new in my book about it, and of course, what is important. And what is important, you certainly all know. For example, the Nord Stream 2 project is a typical example of ignoring Ukraine. It was not an economical project, but a political project with the idea to bypass Ukraine, and this was the geopolitical sense from the Russian side, and it was not difficult to see this. And for me, it's still, I think for us all, it's still unbelievable that after the annexation of Crimea, Nord Stream 2 was realized, although Merkel was in favor for the sanctions, there was a clear idiotism or a great ambivalence in German policy. This is quite known. Something what is not known, for example, is that Putin already, as a vice mayor of Petersburg in 1993, was in favor of an extension of Russia on behalf of Ukraine, that he said there is an independent Ukraine, but not a really independent Ukraine, and that Russia can always take measures against it. And something else what struck me is the role Chancellor Kohl played. I mean, he's a highly interesting figure. He was a strong chancellor, not only because of unification, but also because he really had strong visions. And after 1989, he had an idea what to do with Eastern Europe. And of course, this was, first of all, it was about Eastern Germany, to unify Germany. And with this goal, he was ready to have a conflict with the Soviet Union at that time, with Gorbachev. And this went out successfully for him. And after that, there was the question of a unified Europe and of collaboration with the direct neighbors in the East. And there he had, with regard to Poland, he had the vision that there should be no borders, that there should be intense contact and exchange. And the model, of course, was the German-French friendship after 1945. He wanted to repeat this success of Adenauer's Germany. And with regard to Ukraine, after 1991, he had good relations to Kravchuk. Kravchuk was often in Bonn, and they had a direct contact also by phone. But it is clear from the sources that Ukraine was part of the Russian sphere for Kohl, and that he did not want to touch it. Well, I think the American policy is not different from that, but it was for me striking to see this contradiction between visionary Unitarian Kohl with regard to Poland and another Kohl with regard to Ukraine. Yeah.
Я можу навіть трошки доповнити. Ви знаєте, що Інститут історії сучасності в Мюнхені видає Auswärtige Amt збірники документів, які останнім часом вони, і здається, останнє було видано 92 чи 93 рік. І там є дуже багато цікавих матеріалів про зустріч Коля, наприклад, розшифровка, стенограма їхньої зустрічі, де вони обговорюють різні проблеми, і в тому числі Коль з Єльциним обговорюють проблему України. І Єльцин вже тоді буквально говорив про те, що навіщо вам потрібна ця Україна? Віддайте нам Україну, ми будемо. Або інший момент, тоді, коли ви знаєте, що тоді ж обговорювалося питання про виведення з Німеччини групи радянських військ. Там величезна група радянських військ знаходилась, здається, 500 тисяч чоловік. Це з усіма обслуговуючим персоналом. І для того, щоб їх розмістити, німецький уряд виділив великі гроші. Декілька мільярдів німецьких марок, для того, щоб можна було побудувати приміщення для військових. І вони мали бути розподілені в тому числі і на території України, на території Росії, Білорусі. Так ось Єльцин говорить, навіщо вам віддавати ці гроші Україні, віддайте їх нам. Так що Коль грав таку доволі цікаву роль.
Serhiy mentions the story was recently revealed in this collection of documents. Institute в München. So the Institute for the current, for Zeitgeschichte, contemporary history in Munich, published the collection of documents that are on the Russian-German relations 92-93. There has a two moments, discussion or meeting Kohl and Yeltsin. The documents of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany. So it has a protocol or minutes of the meeting of Kohl and Yeltsin, and Yeltsin suggests, ask Kohl, why do you need this Ukraine? Give this Ukraine to us. So we have to have it. And the second one, the story was that there was approximately 500,000 Russian Soviet soldiers and officers on the staff that has to be transported back to the Soviet Union, back to the to the Russia and the Ukraine, and Yeltsin said that why do you need to give this money to Ukraine? Give it to us. I mean, this transportation money. Just on the margins, we had recently disclosed documents by the Washington White House on 92, 93, and there's also minutes of talks between Yeltsin and Bill Clinton. And have the same kind of the story, similar story when Yeltsin says that we have to share our sphere of influence in Europe, that you will take at the Western Europe, we will take at Eastern Europe. For other questions, I just wonder, is there any kind of the effect that this kind of GDR part of the story of Putin had a kind of effect on the German history? Was it kind of was he noticed that when he was in GDR? Was it kind of minor figure, or there are some kind of the stories that we know since then? I don't remember how long was that, but Putin was a minor officer, KGB officer in GDR. And we don't know that much details, because everything which is about Putin kept in kind of the silenced nowadays in Soviet Union. Do we have any kind of documents from the German part? Do you know anything about this activity, or we just unnoticed?
About Putin's activities, interests?
In GDR.
Okay. I do not know anything about it. There are, of course, some people remember him, but I do not know anything significant about that.
You said, and I agree with you, that it's not easy to understand Angela Merkel behavior, because on the one hand, she was in favor of after 2014 of sanctions to Russia. She didn't like Putin so much, clearly from her memoirs at that point. On the other hand, she made political and economic choices that were very contradictory to this. And I discussed this with Professor Plochy recently at length, and he put forward the following idea. So it's not my idea, and I want your comment. And he said that this basically was not only German, but basically German idea, that Brandt, if you want, opening to the east, the worked. That is, if you gave Moscow, because they didn't make a distinction between the Soviet Union and Russia, economic benefits, at the end Moscow would give you something politically. And they believed from the Ostpolitik of Brandt up to the end that this worked. And to leave this idea after 50 years, basically, to abandon this idea was very difficult. That is, you needed really to, and this is how Serhiy, if I understood him correctly, of course, explained the fact that when the Americans in 2014 left the Ukrainian question to the French and the German, basically to the German with the Minsk agreement, there was such a huge failure diplomatically in a way, because they were reluctant to abandon the idea that concession to Russia were the best tools in changing Russian attitude. And at the end, they produced reform in Russia. Would you agree with this thesis that, at least as far as I understood, Serhiy put forward when we discussed this?
Yeah, of course, the raison d'etre, the Ostpolitik indeed was that you have to give something and get something
politically
back.
Yeah.
And it worked. It was a success story. It was the only moment in the second half of the 20th century or in the entire 20th century, maybe when Germany had a successful world policy. And therefore this Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt is a myth in Germany, and also for its real impacts on the German-German relations between Eastern and Western Germany. And for this time of Willy Brandt, one could even not say that it was cynical because there was also a policy towards Poland, and you know the image of Willy Brandt at the monument in Warsaw. But in the time of Helmut Schmidt, this turned into tourism of German politicians who went to Eastern Berlin and to Moscow just to get some improvements for the inner German relations. And at the end, this is the policy of Steinmeier. There left this idea, there remained this idea that there should be more economic exchange, and this economic exchange would automatically lead to better political relations. And this is an idea without actors. You have just like, it's like an invisible hand. You have the economy, and then you will have beneficial results in humanitarian and political issues. And this certainly was also an idea of Merkel, who should have known better because she knew Russian. She had a very clear impression of Putin. I don't think that she was as naive as other German politicians. And for this reason, it's so difficult to explain this Nord Stream 2 decision.
So the question is that basically they do ignore Ukrainian factor, or they're not aware of this factor, or they intentionally ignore this factor. Who was the first chancellor that ever visited Kyiv? Who was the first chancellor that ever visited Kyiv? It's hard to answer because you don't know. Was the хто з канцлерів відвідав Україну, Київ?
З канцлерів?
Так.
До 90-го року?
Взагалі, хто був перший? Меркель приїжджала до Києва? Ні. This is something which is evident. There's no chancellor visiting ever Kyiv. So this is tell you something. This is quite of ignorance. So Ukraine emerged only as a result or because of this war, largely.
Ігнорування України почалося ще із Шмідта.
So Serhiy claims this ignorance started with Schmidt. Was it result of kind of intentional? Was it kind of result of the mirror effect of the Nazification? Whatever. What was that? This is such ignorance of the Soviet of Ukrainian factor.
Yeah.
Does any explanation, or doesn't need an explanation?
Well, the German politicians knew that Ukraine is somehow a sensible point in the Russian perspective. Ukraine is not Lithuania, or is not, let's say, Uzbekistan, but is a big country also in Soviet times, which is in the perspective of German politicians, it's crucial for the Soviet Union, and therefore one did not want to provoke Russia. This is and the Soviet Union before. This is one could say this is indeed the threat in the German policy towards Moscow.
Professor Valdemar Sklokin.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Schulze Wessel for really fascinating and thought-provoking book. It's really a challenging task to write such synthetic works, and I enjoyed reading it very much. So I agree with colleagues who say that this is really a big achievement. And I think one of the strong points of this book that you problematize the notion of Ukrainianness, and you show how this Ukrainian nation building was kind of included into this German-Ukrainian relations. Yes, so Ukrainians wanted to appeal to Germans politically, to use Germany for their own nation building, and Germans wanted to use Ukrainians for their nation and imperial building. But here I have a provocative question, related to a question asked by Professor Graziosi about the differences between 18th and 19th century perception of Ukraine and Germany. Why in the 18th century there was supposedly more knowledge about Ukraine, and it started to disappear in the 19th century. Actually, I don't agree with this. I think that there was comparably similar quantity of knowledge produced on Ukraine by Germans in the 19th century. But maybe the reason is that something changed both with Germany and with the nature of communication. Yes, so my question is, what was Germany and who did belong to Germany during the 19th century? Don't we need also problematize also the notion of Germany and Germanness? Why do I ask this? I just finished reading another excellent book by American historian David Blackburn, Germany in the World, a Global History, and he complicates our understanding of what was Germany and where can we look for German history. Yeah, and in the 19th century, we had dozens of thousands of Germans who lived in the Ukrainian lands in the Russian Empire, and they produced quite a lot of different works about these lands, and many of them clearly distinguished between Ukrainians and Russians and produced many interesting knowledge. I study Kharkiv and Eastern Ukraine, and even in Kharkiv it was quite a lot of different interesting knowledge on Ukraine and Ukrainians produced by German scholars, travelers, merchants, and so on and so forth. The question is actually why this knowledge didn't reach so effectively other parts of Germany, I think. Yes, so what did change in the 19th century that kind of there was much less not so much knowledge, but kind of awareness here about Ukraine in different German lands as such. Yes, so don't we need somehow to problematize? So this is what I was missing when I was reading your chapter on the 19th century and early 20th century. So you somehow tend to take for granted the existence of Germany and Germanness, but you kind of challenge and the Ukrainianness. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the comment and also the provocative question. And I will have to read Blackburn. And with regard to your question, probably there was more knowledge production about Ukraine by Germans and in Germany than in the 18th century, but on the backdrop of a general development of knowledge production. I mean, in the 19th century, there's generally more knowledge production and more printing than in the 18th century. But the main difference is that the framing was another one. In the 18th century, you of course did not have this national framing, which occurred in the 19th century. And after that, the crucial question was, does a community, does a country, does it belong to the family of European nations? And this was independent from the fact whether there was a nation state. For example, the Poles were regarded as a nation, and the Ukrainians, if I'm right, were not regarded as a nation, but as inhabitants of a region, and therefore some writers were read, but not many. Some compositors were also received, but not so many. And this makes the difference. But I would admit that history of the 18th, 19th century would be a great topic for another book. I mean, I just have some pages about the 19th and early 20th century. And this is for me more a starting point than really intense reflection. I would admit this. Yeah.
There has been a minor episode which is missed in your book, but it has a kind of a reaction here in Ukrainian discussion. In 1888, the Gerhard, who was probably one of the leading idealists of Bismarck, wrote a short article about the German Eastern politics. And he played with the idea of creation, which he called Kiev Princehood, Kievskie Knyazevstvo, which was taken here that Bismarck was supposed to support the idea of political independence. And this raised a discussion in the 90s. In this region, not in the Russian part, but this was very much discussed, that this is basically, they were thinking really that this is Bismarck as a support of Ukrainian independence stand to undermine Russian empire. This particular moment that I know, probably there are some other, but this is something which is very there. And I probably have a hypothesis, because even for German traveler or German scholars who will be in Kharkiv, for them distinction, the difference between Russian and Ukrainians was like the difference between Bavarian and Prussians or Silesians, because still Ukraine also was promotized notion, so they don't give this kind of national dimension with this kind of differences. This something has to be studied. But therefore, I'm saying Gerhard was very important because he was the first to raise as a political importance of this political, which means this is a nation or this potential nation. There's an ethnic group of them, but political potential nation. Liana, have something to say here?
Yeah, I wanted to come back for a minute for this discussion about first German Chancellor, and then I was like listening to you, I was thinking maybe, if we shift a bit into the direction of social history, for example, in the 90s, a lot of Poles like from that were living before in these territories, they were coming back and visiting and recording, I don't know, like home video movies about coming back home. I mean, it was also very influential phenomena in Jewish history, also Jewish Jews coming back to Ukraine and looking for their shtetls and recording these videos and photos. Was it also a case for Germany, and were there in Germany this special community, maybe Landsmannschafts, and were they coming back in the 90s? And I don't know, were this also a kind of this social phenomena, especially in these communities? They were recording some videos or taking photos, how they were coming back to their villages and talking with locals.
Well, I know this for the Sudeten Germans, for example, Sudeten Germans, and of course also for the Silesian or East Prussian Germans. I do not know this for the Schwarzmeer Germans. Yeah.
I do know about Karpatendeutschen, Galician-Deutschen. They have their journal association until the 1970s. They still preserve this identity, the kind of very Landmannschaft kind of things. Interesting enough, the same goes for Galician Jews. There's some communities of Galician Jews until 1970s. Probably was physical barriers, which someone remembers to say, until this biologically, this generation was fading away. So they start, but basically until 1970s, there's still some small communities. They still kept their Deutsch-German Galician identity.
Yeah, and there's for the Carpato-Ukrainians, there is a circle in Munich, and I know them. Yes, of course.
Thank you so much. And let's give applause to Professor Schulze Wessel's excellent book. And Professor Serhiy Stelmakh, who is translating this book. Thank you so much.